Silas Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. The door of Gideon Ashcroft's ranch swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and the man who filled the frame wasn't asking permission for anything. He was broad through the shoulders, red in the face, and his eyes had the particular shine of someone who had already decided how this morning was going to end. Ashcroft, his voice carried through the whole yard. I want her gone. Gideon was standing by the water pump, shirt half tucked, still holding the coffee he hadn't finished. He didn't say anything. You hear me? Silas stepped off the porch like he owned the boards beneath his boots. And the truth was, he owned most things around here. That woman of yours is cutting into business that doesn't belong to her. I want her packed up and gone before the week is out, or I will find another way to make it happen. And you know I can. He let that last sentence sit in the cold morning air like smoke. Gideon still didn't answer, because the worst part, the part that made his jaw tighten and his stomach drop, was that he knew Silas wasn't bluffing. He never bluffed. He didn't need to. If you've ever watched someone you love become a target and felt completely powerless to stop it, then you already know exactly how Gideon Ashcroft felt standing in that yard. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. And when you finish watching today, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Silas was really afraid of, you have to understand what Eliza Rowan walked into on the day she arrived. The letter had taken 6 weeks to reach her. By the time Eliza Rowan read it the first time, she'd already read 3 others just like it. Men in territories she'd never seen, describing land she couldn't picture, using words like comfortable and established that she'd learned through hard experience usually meant something closer to barely standing and desperate. She had learned to read between the lines of those letters the way a sailor reads the sky. What a man described and what a man actually had were 2 entirely different things. Gideon Ashcroft's letter was different, and not in the way she expected. He didn't oversell. He wrote 3 short paragraphs on paper that was slightly water-stained at the corner, describing a cattle and grain operation in Wyoming territory that was, in his own words, struggling. He said the cabin needed work. He said he had 2 ranch hands who wouldn't win any prizes for conversation. He said the winters were brutal and the nearest town was 11 miles of bad road away. Then he wrote one more line, almost as if he'd added it at the last second. I need someone practical more than I need someone perfect. Eliza had read that line 4 times. Then she folded the letter, put it in the inside pocket of her coat, and started packing. She wasn't what most people would call an obvious choice for a mail-order bride. She was 31, which already put her on the far edge of what most frontier men were advertising for. She was lean in the way that women who have worked with their hands all their lives go lean, not from lack of food, but from using her body as a tool. Her hair was dark and she kept it practical, twisted up and pinned without ceremony. She had strong hands and a direct way of looking at people that some men found comfortable and a lot of men found unsettling. She had spent 11 years in her late aunt's sail-making shop on the coast of Massachusetts, learning a trade that most people didn't know existed and even fewer respected. Canvas, thread, waxed cord, the geometry of tension and load-bearing seams, how to read a piece of fabric for where it was going to fail before it actually did, how to fix a torn thing so thoroughly that the repair became stronger than the original. She packed her toolkit the way some women pack their best dresses, carefully, deliberately, with the full understanding that these things were not decorative, they were survival. The train ride west took 4 days. She arrived at the station in Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the air already had that particular Wyoming edge to it, the kind of cold that doesn't apologize. She stepped onto the platform with a single trunk and a long leather bag that clanked heavily when she set it down, and she looked around the way she always looked at new places, measuring, not admiring. Gideon Ashcroft was leaning against a post at the far end of the platform. She recognized him the same way she recognized load-bearing seams, by what he wasn't doing. He wasn't performing. He wasn't straightening up and putting on a smile when he saw her coming. He was just standing there, watching her walk toward him with the expression of a man who was trying very hard to prepare himself for whatever this was going to turn out to be. He was taller than she'd imagined, lean too, but in the way of a man who works hard and doesn't always eat enough. He had dark circles under his eyes that weren't from one bad night. Those were the circles of a long season. His hat was good, but old. His coat had been mended at the left elbow, and whoever had done it didn't know what they were doing, because the thread was pulling already and would tear out completely before winter. She noticed that before she noticed anything else. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft." They looked at each other for a moment. This was always the strange part. The moment where two people who have agreed on paper to share a life have to figure out what they actually think of each other face to face. "That your only trunk?" he asked. "And that," she said, nodding at the leather bag. He glanced at it. "What's in it?" "Tools." Pause. "What kind of tools?" "Sewing tools mostly, canvas work, some leather repair, a few things for tack." He looked at the bag again and then looked at her, and she could see him trying to calculate something, whether this was charming or strange or both. She didn't help him figure it out. She picked up her end of the trunk and waited. The ride out to the ranch took nearly 2 hours on a road that fully deserved its reputation. The wagon had a spring that was no longer doing its job, and the horse, a bay gelding with an opinion about mud, made the whole thing take longer than it should have. Gideon talked some. Not nervously, more like a man who'd been alone long enough that conversation required a little warming up first. He told her about the cattle herd, which was smaller than last year. He told her the grain harvest had been decent, but not what he'd hoped. He mentioned the two hands, brothers named Cal and Denny, and described them as reliable when they want to be, which she read as unreliable about half the time. He told her the cabin had been built by the previous owner and that he'd meant to add a proper floor in the front room but hadn't gotten to it. She listened. She asked a few questions, practical ones. What was the primary source of income, cattle or grain? What equipment did they run? How old was the main wagon? He answered each one, and she noticed that he seemed slightly surprised each time. Not that she was asking, but that she was asking that kind of question. Not questions about curtains or whether there was a proper stove or how far the church was on Sundays. "You're not what I expected," he said at one point, without seeming to mean to say it out loud. "What did you expect?" A long pause. "I don't know. Someone who'd ask about the curtains first." She looked at him. "Do you have curtains?" "No." "Then there's nothing to ask about." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, but it was close. When the ranch came into sight, she took it in without speaking. The cabin itself was small but solid enough. The barn was larger than she'd expected, which was a good sign. There was a chicken coop listing slightly to the left, a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for the season, and a water pump that had been repaired recently and not well. And there, sitting in the yard between the cabin and the barn, was the thing that changed everything. A wagon. Not the one they'd arrived in. A second one, older, its canvas cover ripped in a long diagonal tear that ran from the top corner nearly to the side rail. The tear was maybe 4 feet long and had clearly happened some time ago because the edges were frayed and darkening. Gideon didn't even look at it as he pulled the horse to a stop. It was the kind of thing you stop seeing after a while, when it becomes part of the landscape of a problem you don't know how to fix. Eliza stepped down before he could come around to help her, and she walked straight toward that wagon. "Miss Rowan," Gideon said, half confused, half amused. "The cabin is the other—" "I see the cabin." She was already crouching beside the wagon, her fingers reading the tear the way she read everything. By touch first, then sight. The canvas was good weight, mid-grade, maybe 8 years old. The tear wasn't rot, it was stress, probably a branch or a rock edge underload. The rest of the cover was sound. "This is repairable," she said. "I know, I just haven't had the—" "How long has it been like this?" A pause. "Since July." She looked up at him. "The grain I was planning to use it for," he said, and his voice had that particular flatness of a man describing a loss he's gotten tired of feeling. "Got wet. Lost about a third of it." She stood up. She looked at the wagon, and then she looked at him, and she said the thing she had come all this way prepared to say, not dramatically, not as a speech, just as a fact she was putting on the table between them. "Mr. Ashcroft, I will keep the house. I'll do what a wife does inside, and I won't complain about the floor, but I'm not going to be most useful to you in there." She glanced at the wagon and then back at him. "I'm going to be most useful out here." He stared at her for a long moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. He was a man with a clear picture in his head of what a wife was supposed to look like on a ranch, and she was standing in front of him, dismantling it piece by piece in the first 10 minutes. "The hands will say things," he said finally. "They always do. The neighbors will talk." "They will." She picked up her leather bag. "They'll stop when they see the numbers." He didn't know what to say to that. She didn't wait for him to figure it out. She carried her bag toward the barn to look for her materials, and he stood in the yard watching her go, and the look on his face was impossible to name cleanly. It was somewhere between bewilderment and the first faint stirring of something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that might, eventually, be hope. Cal and Denny Marsh were brothers in the way that some brothers are, one of them getting all the patience and the other getting none of it. Cal was the older one, steady and quiet in the way of a man who'd figured out that most things weren't worth the energy of a reaction. Denny was 23 and had strong opinions about the way things were supposed to be done. The morning after Eliza arrived, she was outside at first light, working on the wagon cover. She had her awl, her heavy needles, her waxed sailmaker's thread. She had cut a reinforcing patch from a piece of canvas she'd found in the back of the barn, old but sound, and she was stitching it into place with the particular rhythm of someone who has done this so many times the hands do it while the brain is somewhere else entirely. Denny came out of the bunkhouse, stopped, and stared. "What in the world?" he said, not to her, but to the general air around him. She didn't look up. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "You know that's not how you fix canvas. You can't just— Can you hand me that smaller awl? It's on the step there." He looked at the awl, looked at her, did not pick it up. "I'm just saying," he continued, "it's not going to hold. You patch canvas like that, first load you put in there, it's going to tear right through again. Better off just getting a new cover." She set down her needle and looked at him for the first time. She didn't look annoyed. She looked like someone deciding how much to explain. "A new cover for this wagon costs $11 and takes 6 weeks to order," she said. "This repair will take me 2 hours and cost about 30 cents in materials. The seam I'm putting in is a flat-felled reinforced double stitch with a backing patch. It will be stronger than the original weave when I'm done. I've been doing this for 11 years and I have never had one of these fail." She picked up her needle again. "But if you'd like to watch and tell me everything I'm doing wrong, you're welcome to." Denny's mouth opened, closed. He walked away without the awl. Cal, who had been leaning against the barn door frame watching the whole exchange, walked over and picked up the awl and set it beside her on the step without a word. "Thank you," she said. "He'll come around," Cal said. "They usually do." By mid-morning, the wagon cover was done. Gideon came over to look at it before he went out to the south pasture, and he ran his hand along the repaired seam without saying anything. The stitching was tight and even, and the patch lay perfectly flat. You could see where it had been torn if you knew where to look. If you didn't, you might never notice. "Solid," he said. "It'll outlast the wagon," she said. He nodded slowly. He was working something out behind his eyes, she could tell, recalculating something he'd been running the wrong way for a while. "There's a saddle in the barn," he said carefully. "Left side billet strap is about to go. I'll look at it this afternoon. And the grain sacks from last season, I already looked at them this morning." She'd been up before anyone else. "About a third of them are done. The rest I can repair. I'll need more wax thread and some lard for waterproofing." He stared at her. "You went through the grain sacks this morning." "I was up early. I couldn't sleep." He looked like he didn't know whether to be impressed or alarmed that his new wife's first response to insomnia was to inventory the damaged goods in his storage barn. He settled on something in between. "I'll get you the thread and the lard," he said. The neighbors started noticing within 2 weeks, which was faster than Eliza had expected and faster than Gideon had hoped. It wasn't any one thing. It was the wagon going out with a sound cover. It was the saddle in proper repair. It was the grain sacks, waterproofed and strong, sitting in the storage barn ready for the next harvest. Small things, each one. But a ranch is a collection of small things. And when those small things start working properly instead of slowly failing, the whole operation changes its sound somehow, like an instrument coming into tune. The problem was the valley had its own particular kind of instrument, and its name was Silas Crow. He ran the general store in Mill Haven, and he also ran the supply contracts for most of the ranches within 30 miles, and those two things together had made him the most quietly powerful man in the territory. Power that came not from any office or any election, but from the simple fact that when you needed something, you needed him. New canvas? Silas. Replacement tack? Silas. Grain sacks? Silas. He sold the things that broke, and things broke constantly out here, and that was a business model that had never once kept him up at night. He heard about Eliza Rowan within 3 days of her arrival. His wife's cousin had seen the wagon cover, and that was all it took. By the end of the first week, he knew she had repaired the saddle. By the end of the second week, he'd heard something from a hand at the Mercer Ranch about grain sacks. He didn't do anything yet. He was a patient man. He watched. What he was watching for was failure. Because things did fail out here, say, people, plans, marriages, businesses. He had seen it happen to better operations than Ashcroft's. He just needed to wait for the crack and then put the right pressure in the right place. But the crack didn't come. What came instead, 6 weeks after Eliza Rowan stepped off the train, was a rainstorm. It came in from the northwest on a Saturday night, which is the worst night for a storm because it means your hands are tired from the week and not paying attention the way they should. It came hard and stayed hard. 3 hours of rain that hit like it meant something, the kind of storm that found every weakness in every cover and every seal and drove water through it. Gideon stood on the porch at midnight watching it, which was a thing he'd learned to do over the years because watching was slightly better than not watching. There was nothing to do. The grain was either protected or it wasn't. In the morning, he walked out to the storage barn with the specific dread of a man approaching something he's afraid to see. The grain was dry. Every sack, every last one. Eliza's waterproofing had held completely. The canvas repairs on the storage cover had held. There was not a single wet grain in the building. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to the barn door and looked out across the valley, and he could already hear it, carried on the still air, the sound of other men discovering what the storm had done to their storage. The Mercer Ranch, half a mile east. The Holloway place, up toward the ridge. The low, specific tone of a man who has just walked into a room and found exactly what he was afraid of finding. By afternoon, 3 ranchers had ridden over. Not to congratulate him, not yet, they were too proud for that, but just to look, to see if it was true. It was true. And one of them, a big quiet man named Harlan Mercer, who had lost 400 pounds of grain to the storm, stood in Gideon's storage barn looking at dry, perfectly stacked grain sacks. And then he looked at Eliza standing in the barn doorway, and he said, without any particular expression, "How much would you charge to fix my storage covers?" She told him. He nodded once, got on his horse, and rode home. He was back with the damaged canvas the next morning. Gideon watched her work that afternoon. Watched Harlan Mercer watch her work, the way a skeptical man watches something he doesn't understand but cannot argue with. And he understood, standing there in the cold October air, that something had shifted, not just on the ranch, in the valley. And somewhere in Millhaven, in the back room of his store, Silas Crow was beginning to understand it too. And unlike Gideon, he was not watching with hope. He was watching with something much older and much colder than that. He was watching with the calculation of a man who has decided that a problem needs to be handled before it gets any larger. And Eliza Rowan, threading her needle in the barn, didn't know yet that she had just become someone's problem. But she would. Harlan Mercer was not a man who said thank you easily. He'd grown up in a family where gratitude was something you showed with actions, not words. And after 40 years of living that way, the habit had calcified into something close to a personality trait. So when he came back the morning after dropping off his damaged canvas and found the first 2 storage covers already repaired and folded neatly on his wagon seat, he stood there for a long moment looking at them without saying anything. Eliza was working on the 3rd one, sitting on an upturned crate in the barn, her needle moving in that steady, unhurried rhythm that people who are genuinely good at something have. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just the quiet authority of a person who has done this exact thing so many thousands of times that the hands have developed their own kind of intelligence. "That's double-stitched," Harlan said, picking up one of the finished covers and examining the seam. "Flat-felled double stitch with a backstitch at every fourth pass," she said without looking up. "The original manufacturer used a single running stitch. That's why it failed." He turned the canvas over in his hands. His expression was unreadable in the way of men who are more impressed than they want to admit. "How long will it hold?" "If you keep it clean and dry when it's stored, longer than the canvas itself lasts. The seam won't be what fails." He set it down, picked up the second one, went through the same examination, put it down. "What do you charge?" he asked. She told him the same number she'd told him the day before. "That's too low," he said. She looked up at that. It wasn't what people usually said. "I set my own prices, Mr. Mercer." "I know you do. I'm telling you it's too low. I lost 400 pounds of grain in that storm. These covers would have saved every bit of it. What you're charging me doesn't reflect that." He pulled out his wallet. "I'm paying you double." "That's not necessary." "It's not about necessary." He set the money on the crate beside her. "It's about fair." She looked at the money, looked at him. He wasn't a man who invited argument, and she was practical enough to recognize the difference between charity and justice. "All right," she said. He nodded once, as if that settled something larger than just the price, and walked back to his horse. That was how it started. Not with fanfare, not with any announcement, but with one taciturn rancher paying double and riding away. Word traveled the way word always travels in isolated places, which is faster and with more detail than anyone expects. By the end of that week, 2 more ranchers had sent damaged goods. By the end of the following week, there were 4. Not large jobs, not yet. A tent covering, a pair of saddlebags with cracked stitching, a tarpaulin that had seen too many seasons. Small things, but they added up. Eliza had always kept a ledger. It was a habit from her years in her aunt's shop, where the difference between staying open and closing down had often come down to knowing exactly where every penny came from and where every penny went. She started a new one the week after she arrived, a plain cloth-covered book she'd brought in her trunk, and every repair went into it. Date, item, materials used, time spent, amount charged. 2 columns for comparison, cost of repair versus cost of replacement. The numbers were not subtle. A new wagon cover, $11, 6-week wait. Repair, 40 cents, 2 hours. New grain sacks, a set of 12, $7. Repair, 60 cents, half a day. Replacement tent canvas, medium freight size, $18. Repair of existing, $1.20, 1 day. She showed the ledger to Gideon one evening after supper, not to impress him, but because she thought he should understand what was happening in his own barn. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and read through the columns slowly, the way a man reads something that is rearranging his understanding of a situation. "This is 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks and 2 days. He looked up. "Eliza, this is more than the cattle brought in last month." "I know." He put the ledger down and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was a thing she'd noticed he did when he was thinking hard, just briefly disconnecting from everything in the room to work something out in his head. "The hands are still giving you trouble?" he asked. She considered the question. "Cal's been helpful. Denny has mostly stopped saying things to my face, which is an improvement. I'll talk to him." "You don't need to. He'll come around when the money starts mattering to him." "It already matters to him. He just doesn't want to be wrong in front of somebody." She understood that. Men who couldn't admit they'd been wrong were a particular kind of exhausting, but they weren't usually a permanent problem. They adjusted when reality gave them no other option. Denny would adjust. The question was how long it would take him and how much noise he'd make in the process. As it turned out, it took exactly 1 more week, and the thing that did it was a tent. One of the neighboring operations, a small outfit run by a man named Fletcher, who raised horses and had more optimism than capital, brought in a canvas tent so badly torn it looked like something had tried to eat it. 3 separate tiers, one of them nearly 2 feet long, all of them running in different directions, the kind of damage that looked hopeless on first inspection. Denny saw it come in. He stood in the barn doorway looking at the pile of torn canvas with the expression of a man watching someone about to make a very public mistake. "That's not fixable," he said. It wasn't directed at Eliza specifically. It was directed at the universe. "Come hold this corner," she said. I'm just saying, Denny." She looked at him, not angry, just direct. "I don't need your opinion on whether it's fixable. I need you to hold this corner so I can see where the tension is running." A long pause. The kind of pause where you could almost hear the internal argument a person is having with themselves. He walked over and held the corner. She worked for 2 hours while he stood there, shifting his weight occasionally, watching her hands do things with a needle and thread that didn't look like they should be possible. She didn't explain as she went. She didn't perform. She just worked, and the tent came back together the way things come back together when someone who genuinely understands their material is doing the work. Not perfectly, because nothing is ever perfectly repaired, but solidly, honestly, in a way that would hold. When she was done, she handed him one edge of the repaired section. "Pull." He looked at her. "Pull it. As hard as you want." He pulled. The seam didn't move. He pulled harder. Nothing. He let go of it and stood there looking at his own hands for a second, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face had shifted into something she hadn't seen from him yet. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was closer to the look of a person who has just been shown that the world is slightly different from what they thought. "How do you do that?" he said. "I'll show you," she said, "if you want to learn." He didn't say yes immediately, but he didn't say no either, and she'd learned that with Denny, that was close enough. The next morning, he was in the barn before she was. She found him sitting on the crate with a piece of scrap canvas and one of her heavy needles, attempting a flat-felled stitch with the particular concentration of someone who is used to being competent and is currently not. He'd gotten the first pass right. The second pass had gone sideways. She sat down beside him without saying anything about the sideways stitch, took out her own needle, and started working on the project waiting for her, a set of saddle pockets that needed new stitching along the bottom seam. After a few minutes, she said, without looking up, "You're pulling the thread too tight on the back pass. Let it sit looser. The tension comes from the weave, not the thread." He adjusted. The next stitch was better. They worked side by side in the barn for an hour without much conversation, and it was the most comfortable hour Eliza had spent at the ranch since she'd arrived. It was also the hour that Silas Crow chose to pay his first visit. She heard the horse before she heard anything else. A single rider, moving at the particular pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they have decided they don't need to be. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the stitch she was on, because leaving a stitch halfway was a habit she'd broken herself of years ago. By the time she came to the barn door, Silas Crow was already dismounted and standing in the yard, looking at the wagons and the equipment and the general evidence of what had been happening on this ranch for the past month, with the expression of a man doing accounting in his head. He was shorter than she'd imagined. She'd heard his name spoken in a particular tone by enough people that she'd unconsciously built a picture of someone physically imposing, but he wasn't. He was compact, well-dressed for the territory, with a face that would have been almost pleasant if it weren't for the eyes, which were the particular shade of pale blue that some people have when they've spent a long time looking at things they want and calculating how to get them. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, though she hadn't introduced herself. "Mr. Crow." She'd been told enough about him to recognize him back. He smiled. It was a skilled smile, so warm on the surface, nothing behind it. "I've been hearing good things. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself properly. We're neighbors in a sense, all of us out here. Community matters." "It does," she said. "I understand you've been doing some repair work for the ranchers in the area." He said it lightly, conversationally, as if he was merely making an observation about the weather. "Impressive, from what I hear. People have been kind." He looked past her at the barn, where Denny was still visible, working on his practice piece. "It's good work. What you're doing. Helping out neighbors. That's the spirit of this valley." A pause. "Of course, there's a difference between helping neighbors and running a competing operation. I'm sure you understand that." She looked at him. She let the sentence sit for a moment before she answered, because she'd found that people who say things like that usually need a moment to hear what they've actually said. "I'm not sure I understand the distinction," she said pleasantly. Could you explain it? His smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A small adjustment, like a man recalibrating the range on a rifle. Ranching families help each other out. That's community. When someone starts undercutting the established supply trade, charging prices that can't be sustained, creating an expectation in the market, that's something different that destabilizes things. I charge fair prices. You charge prices that make my replacement goods look expensive, which they aren't. They're quality products, Mrs. Ashcroft, fairly priced for a fair market. He spread his hands. I just hate to see a misunderstanding cause friction in the valley. Your husband has a good relationship with my store. I'd hate for that to change. The sentence landed exactly the way he meant it to land, with just enough weight that it couldn't be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She kept her voice completely even. I'll be sure to let Gideon know you stopped by. Silas Crow nodded, still smiling, got back on his horse, and rode away at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with. Eliza stood in the yard until he was out of sight. Then she went back inside to the ledger and opened it, and she sat there for a few minutes, not writing anything, just thinking in the particular focused way she thought when she was measuring a problem. Not angry. Anger was a distraction, just measuring. She knew what he was afraid of because it was written clearly in his numbers, if you knew how to read them. A new wagon cover at $11 was an $11 sale for Silas. A repaired cover at 40 cents was 40 cents that didn't go to him, and one fewer customer who needed his product. Multiply that by every rancher in the valley and every piece of equipment that wore out every season, and what you had was not a neighborly wife doing small favors. What you had was a direct and growing threat to a monopoly he'd been running without competition for years. He would come back. She knew that as clearly as she knew the difference between a weak seam and a sound one. The only question was what form it would take next time. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The rumor started the following week, the way rumors always start. Not as a lie exactly, but as a question, a doubt. The kind of thing that doesn't need to be true to do damage. It just needs to be said in the right tone in the right company. Someone had mentioned to someone at the grain exchange in Mill Haven that the repairs going around the valley were done by a woman with no formal training, no certification, no shop, just a kit she'd brought from back east. And wasn't it curious that her prices were so low? Quality work didn't come cheap. If the prices seemed too good, maybe the work was too. Gideon heard it from Cal, who heard it in town. He came back from the supply run tighter in the jaw than he'd left. People are talking, he said, setting the supplies on the kitchen table with slightly more force than necessary. About what specifically? He told her. She listened without interrupting, which he had started to notice was how she listened to things she considered important. Completely still, completely focused. Do you believe it? She said when he finished. No. The word came out quickly enough that she believed him. But that doesn't matter much, does it? People hear something enough times, they start to wonder, she finished. I know. He sat down at the table and rubbed his face with both hands, and for a moment he looked very tired in the specific way of a man who has been trying to hold something together for a long time and is not sure how many more things he can absorb before something gives. I don't want you to stop, he said. I want to be clear about that. What you're doing is working. The numbers don't lie. He stopped. You're worried about what happens when a rumor takes hold, she said. I'm worried about Crow. He looked at her. He's not a man who lets things alone. She nodded. She appreciated that he said it directly instead of wrapping it in something softer. That was one of the things she'd come to notice about Gideon. He wasn't a complicated man in the way of men who say one thing and mean three others. When he said something, he meant it. It was a quality she didn't take for granted. He's going to need a bigger lever than a rumor, she said. He'll find one. Maybe. She opened the ledger. But while he's looking, we keep working. The best answer to people saying the work isn't good is to make the work undeniable. He looked at the ledger. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. A small loosening around the eyes. You know, he said, when I wrote that letter, the one you answered, I remember. I genuinely thought I was asking for somebody to help keep the house in order. Maybe do some cooking and keep me from talking to myself so much. He shook his head slowly. I had no idea. No idea of what? He looked at her. That I was asking for a business partner. She considered that for a moment. Does that bother you? A long pause. Longer than she expected, and then he said, No, it really doesn't. I think that might be the thing that surprises me most about this whole situation. She went back to the ledger. He went back to his coffee. Outside, the wind had come up from the north and was doing something complicated with the dead leaves on the cottonwood by the water pump, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything more than what was already there. 3 days later, Eliza took on her largest job yet. A freighting outfit passing through the territory, a man named Burl Donegan, who ran 4 wagons between 3 mining settlements and the valley, came to the ranch on the recommendation of Harlan Mercer. 2 of his 4 wagon covers were in serious disrepair, one of them so far gone that a lesser person would have told him to get a new one. There was also a substantial tent that served as his field camp, with a tear along the ridge seam that had been spreading unchecked for 2 seasons. He was a big, direct man with no patience for anything that wasted his time, and he looked at Eliza's toolkit with the same initial skepticism she had learned to expect from men of his particular type. The kind of skepticism that is entirely impersonal, the way a man might look at a bridge he's not sure will hold his loaded wagon. Mercer says you're worth what you charge, he said. That's for you to decide. He also said you finished a 2-day job in 1 day. When the material cooperates, yes. He looked at the tent, which she had already unfolded and was running her hands along the ridge seam, reading it the way she read everything first. How long for all of it? Come back the day after tomorrow. He looked doubtful. That's fast. I'll have it done or I won't charge you. He thought about that for a moment. Fair, he said. She worked that night past dark, which was not something Gideon asked her to do and not something she did for show. She did it because the tent ridge seam had a secondary stress point further along that she hadn't seen at first, and finding it late meant fixing it now before she finished and had it come apart on Donegan somewhere in the mountains in bad weather. She fixed the primary tear, reinforced the secondary stress point, re-waterproofed the entire ridge with a lard and wax compound she'd mixed herself, and went over both wagon covers twice, once for repair and once for reinforcement, catching a handful of places that hadn't failed yet, but would have by spring. When she finished, she sat back on the barn floor with her shoulders aching and her hands stiff from the cold, and looked at what she'd done in the lamplight, and she did the thing she always did at the end of a big job. She looked at each seam, each patch, each reinforced section, and asked herself whether she would stake her reputation on every inch of it. She would. Donegan came back the day after. He went over the tent and both covers with the methodical attention of a man who had been burned by shoddy work before, checking every seam, pressing the patches, examining the ridge waterproofing. He didn't rush. Eliza let him take his time. When he was done, he straightened up and looked at her. The ridge seam, he said. You found the secondary point. You knew about it? I suspected. Couldn't find it myself. He paused. I've had professional shops in 2 territories miss that. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything necessary to say. He paid her what she asked, added a percentage without being asked, and then he said something that she didn't realize until later was more important than the payment. I work with a railroad survey crew, he said. They're coming through this part of the territory in the spring, major construction push, running line through the mountains. They're going to need field equipment maintained for the whole season. Dozens of tents, hundreds of canvas pieces, wagon covers, packs. He looked at her steadily. If you're still operating in the spring, I'll give them your name. She kept her expression neutral. Inside, something shifted. Not excitement exactly, but the particular sensation of seeing a door open that you hadn't known was there. I'll be operating, she said. He nodded, loaded his wagons, and drove out of the yard. Eliza stood in the cold watching him go. Then she went inside and sat down with her ledger and looked at the numbers she'd been building for the past 6 weeks. She looked at them for a long time. Then she turned to a fresh page and started writing something different. Not a record of what had already been done, but a projection. What it would cost to take on a job that size, what supplies she'd need, whether she could do it alone or whether she'd need help, and where that help might come from. She was still writing when Gideon came in from the evening chores. He looked at the open ledger and the pages of calculations and sat down across from her without interrupting. She told him about Donegan's offer. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "A railroad contract. A possibility of one, nothing guaranteed. Eliza." He said her name the way he'd started to say it, not formally, but with a kind of weight. That's not a small thing. No, it's not. It's also exactly the kind of thing that would make Crow come after us much harder than a rumor. I know. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low because neither of them had noticed. And in the dim light, he looked both tired and more alive than he had since she'd arrived. The particular look of a man who is frightened and engaged and not entirely sure those two things are different. "Are you ready for that?" he asked. She thought about Silas Crow's smile, the weight in his last sentence, the way he'd looked at the barn like he was already calculating what it would cost him to shut it down. "He's going to come regardless," she said, "whether we're small or whether we're growing. If he sees us as a threat at 40 cents a repair, he's not going to leave us alone when we're $1.20. She closed the ledger. "So we might as well be worth threatening." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the ledger and looked at the fresh page. The projections, the supply costs, the calculations she'd been building. "What do you need?" he said. "More thread, more canvas stock. And I want to teach Cal the double stitch properly. He's got good hands." She paused. "And Denny's getting better faster than I expected." Gideon set the ledger down. He looked at her in that direct way of his that still occasionally caught her slightly off guard because she wasn't used to being looked at straight on like that, without pretense or performance. "I wrote that letter," he said slowly, "because I thought I needed someone to keep the house from feeling so empty." He shook his head. "I didn't understand what I was actually asking for." "You said practical," she reminded him. "That's what I am. That's not what I meant." She raised an eyebrow. "I meant—" He stopped, started again. "I meant I didn't understand that I was asking for someone who might save the whole thing." He said it quietly, without drama, like a man making an observation that is also underneath it something he is not quite ready to name completely. The lamp guttered. One of them should have gotten up to trim it. Neither did. Outside, the wind had died down and the yard was still and the whole valley was quiet in the way it only got after dark, when the cold settled everything into silence. Inside the cabin, the silence was different, not empty, but full of something that was still finding its shape. She closed the ledger gently and said, "Let's get some sleep. I want to start on Cal's lesson early." He nodded. He got up and trimmed the lamp himself. And Silas Crow, alone in the back room of his store 11 miles away, sat with a sheet of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he wrote a letter to a man he knew at the railroad construction office, and what he wrote in that letter had nothing to do with honest business, and everything to do with the cold arithmetic of a man who has decided that patience has run its course. The letter Silas Crow sent to the railroad office took 11 days to produce a result, which was faster than he'd expected and exactly as effective as he'd planned. The result came in the form of a man named Theodore Watt, who arrived in Millhaven on a gray Thursday morning with a leather satchel, a railroad company badge pinned to his coat, and the specific manner of someone who has been given authority and is not shy about using it. He was the regional supply inspector for the Northern Mountain Railroad construction project, the man responsible for evaluating and approving every vendor, contractor, and service provider before the main construction push came through in spring. Silas met him at the station, bought him breakfast, talked for 2 hours. What Silas said during those 2 hours was careful. He was always careful. He didn't say Eliza Rowan was dishonest. He didn't say her work was dangerous. He said he had concerns, the word concerns was doing a great deal of work in that conversation, about unlicensed operations taking advantage of the railroad's need for field equipment maintenance. He said he'd heard from several ranchers that the quality was inconsistent. He said he thought it was worth the inspector's time to look into it before any contracts were awarded, because the last thing a major construction project needed was field tents failing in mountain weather. Theodore Watt listened, nodded in the measured way of a man who is paid to evaluate competing claims, and told Silas he appreciated the information and would conduct a thorough review. Eliza didn't know any of this. She was in the barn teaching Cal the reinforced backstitch when Watt rode out to the ranch 3 days later with Silas's talking points arranged neatly in his thinking and a notebook ready to record whatever he found. She heard the horse and came out to the yard wiping her hands on her work cloth, and she recognized the railroad badge immediately because Donegan had described exactly what it looked like. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" Watt said. "That's right." He introduced himself, explained his role, explained that he was conducting a review of potential service providers in the region ahead of the spring construction season. All of it professional, polite, entirely correct in tone. He asked if he could see her operation. She showed him everything: the barn, the tools, the materials she kept in stock, the ledger. She offered it without being asked, which seemed to surprise him slightly. The completed jobs she had samples of, the pieces she'd kept for exactly this kind of conversation. She walked him through her techniques without being asked to, not as a performance, but because she understood that a man in his position needed to see her think, not just see the finished product. He asked questions. Good ones, some of them. He clearly knew enough about field equipment to ask about load ratings and weather exposure and the specific stresses that mountain construction put on canvas gear. She answered each one directly and completely, and when she didn't know something, she said so, which was a rare thing in her experience and seemed to register with him. They were standing at the barn door, Watt making notes, when he said, almost as an aside, "I've had some concerns raised about the consistency of your work. Reports that some ranchers in the area have had issues." She kept her voice level. "Which ranchers?" "I'm not at liberty to say, just general community feedback." "I see." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Watt, I keep a complete record of every job I've done since I started here. Date, item, customer, materials used, amount charged. I also keep notes on any issues that arose during the repair and how I addressed them." She held up the ledger. "I have not had a single job come back to me. Not one. If there are specific concerns from specific people, I'd like to know about them because I would want to address them. But general community feedback without a name or a job attached to it." She paused. "That's not feedback. That's rumor." Watt looked at her. Then he looked at his notebook. Then he looked back at her. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said slowly, "how long have you been doing this kind of work?" "Professionally? 11 years. Before that, I trained for 3 years in my aunt's shop. 14 years total." "Yes." He wrote something down. She couldn't see what it was. He stayed another hour, examining specific pieces, asking her to demonstrate the flat-felled stitch on a scrap of canvas, watching her hands with the attention of a man who understands that technique is visible when you know what to look for. She didn't rush. She didn't try to impress him. She just worked the way she always worked, which was steadily and without waste. When he left, he shook her hand and said he would be in touch. She watched him ride toward the road that led back to town, and she watched which direction he turned when he reached it, and he turned toward Millhaven, and she knew without any certainty but with a strong working theory that his next stop was Silas Crow's store. She went back inside and updated the ledger. Gideon came in from the north field around noon and she told him about the visit. His jaw did the thing it did. What did he say? That he'd be in touch. That could mean anything. It could, she agreed. But he looked at the ledger. He looked at it properly, not just to be polite, and he asked me to demonstrate the stitch. Meaning? Meaning he was actually evaluating, not just going through motions. She set down her coffee. Someone sent him here with a specific purpose, but I don't think he's the kind of man who stays bought. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Crow? Almost certainly. Can you prove it? No. He sat down at the table. He had mud on his boots from the field and he'd forgotten to leave them at the door, which was unlike him, which meant he was more worried than he was letting show. So we wait. We work, she said. Waiting is what Crow is counting on. He wants us to feel uncertain enough to slow down. She didn't slow down. What she did instead was finish 2 jobs she'd had waiting, start a third, and make a list. It was the kind of list she'd been building in the back of her mind since Donegan mentioned the railroad contract. All the things she would need if the work grew substantially. Canvas stock, waxed thread by the pound rather than the spool, additional awls, proper work tables rather than upturned crates, enough lamp oil to work evenings through the winter. She priced it all out in the ledger margin, then looked at the numbers she had coming in and calculated how long until she could afford it. 2 months, if the current rate held. 6 weeks if she took on the Fletcher job she'd been putting off because the tent was such a wreck. She took on the Fletcher job. The tent was, as expected, a significant piece of work. Fletcher himself helped her lay it out in the yard to see the full extent of it, and when they spread it completely, she heard him make a sound under his breath that was not quite a word. "I know," she said. "Thought it was just the one corner," he said. "The one corner is what you could see from outside. The stress has been traveling along the weave for probably 2 seasons. See here." She showed him the path of it, the way a failing seam moved through fabric like a crack through ice, invisible until it suddenly wasn't. "If you'd put this up in a hard wind this winter, you'd have lost it." Fletcher was a young man, younger than Gideon, with the particular combination of optimism and constant cash shortage that characterized most of the small horse operations in the valley. He looked at the tent with the expression of someone calculating a loss he could barely afford. "How much?" he said. She told him. He winced but nodded. He didn't try to negotiate, which she respected. Some people looked at a low price and tried to take it lower, as if kindness was an invitation to push. Fletcher just nodded and said he'd be back in 3 days. 4, she said. "This one needs time to let the waterproofing cure properly between layers." 4 then. While she worked on the tent over those 4 days, 2 things happened almost simultaneously, and they happened the way significant things often happen in quiet places. Without announcement, without warning, arriving in the same week and changing the entire weight of everything. The first was Theodore Watt's written response. It came by post, addressed formally to Eliza Ashcroft, and she opened it at the kitchen table with Gideon standing by the window pretending to look at something in the yard. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was professional courtesy. "Thank you for your time, appreciated the demonstration, impressive documentation." The second paragraph said that following his review of all potential service providers in the region, he had found her operation to be among the most thoroughly documented and technically sound he had encountered. The third paragraph said that while no formal contracts would be awarded until spring, he was placing her name on the preliminary approval list for canvas and field equipment maintenance, which meant she would be contacted when the construction advance team arrived. She read all 3 paragraphs. Then she set the letter down on the table. Gideon turned from the window. "Well?" She turned the letter so he could read it. He read it. He read it again. Then he put it down and let out a long, slow breath that was not quite a word and not quite a sound, but was clearly something he'd been holding for a while. "Preliminary approval," he said. "It's not a contract yet." "No, but it's the door being open," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. He looked like he wanted to say something and was deciding whether to say it or let it stay where it was. He let it stay. The second thing that happened was Silas Crow, and it was not a letter, and it was not a door being open. It was the opposite of a door being open. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday, unannounced again, but this time without the pretense of community concern. He was direct in the way of a man who has stopped bothering with the longer game because the shorter one has presented itself. Gideon was there this time. He came out of the barn when he heard the horse, and he stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and his jaw set in that particular way, and Eliza came to the barn door and stayed there. Silas dismounted. He didn't waste time. "Ashcroft, I have a proposal for you." "I'm listening," Gideon said. His voice was flat. "Your wife's little operation has created some friction in the valley. I think we all know that. I'm willing to overlook it, the undercutting, the interference with established trade, if we can come to an understanding." Silas reached into his coat and produced a paper. "I'm offering to purchase the repair business from Mrs. Ashcroft at a fair price. A generous price, honestly. She takes the money, goes back to keeping the house. Everyone moves forward without hard feelings." Gideon didn't look at the paper. "What number?" Silas told him. It was on its face, reasonable. It was 3 months of what the repair business had earned, which meant Silas knew exactly what it was earning, which told them something about how well informed he was about their operation. Gideon looked at the paper for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza. She shook her head. One small, clear motion. He looked back at Silas. No. Silas's expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted. The slight adjustment of a man who was not surprised, but was now moving from one plan to another. That's a mistake, Gideon. Probably. I'm trying to do this cleanly. I'd prefer... I heard your preference, Gideon said. Answer's still no. Silas looked past him at Eliza, and she met his eyes without blinking, and in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, she understood that she had just watched a man decide something. Not angrily. That was what made it cold. Not impulsively, with the calm, deliberate quality of someone checking a box. He folded the paper back into his coat. All right, he said. He got back on his horse and rode away, and this time there was no pleasantness in his departure, just the retreating sound of hooves on cold ground. Gideon turned to look at Eliza. He'll go after the railroad contact, she said. I know. He already tried once. Watt didn't take the bait. He'll try something else. Something he can control this time. Gideon rubbed the back of his neck. He's got relationships with the construction company going back years. Supply contracts, equipment sales. He's not just going to write letters. She had been thinking about this since Silas rode away. She was already several steps ahead of where she'd been standing when he made his offer, because that was how she worked. Not reacting to what was happening, but calculating what was coming. He needs an incident, she said. Gideon looked at her. What? A rumor isn't enough anymore. Watt looked at my work and he approved it anyway. So the next move is to create something concrete, something that looks like a failure. She paused. He's going to manufacture a problem and attach my name to it. How? I don't know yet. But it'll be something with the railroad, something visible, something that can't be easily disputed in the moment. She looked at the road where Silas had disappeared. And he'll time it for when the construction crew's here and paying attention. The winter came hard that year, and it came early. By late November, the valley was locked under a cold that had a weight to it, the kind of cold that made everything take twice as long because your hands didn't work right, and the materials stiffened and the horses didn't want to move in the mornings. Eliza kept working. She added lamp oil to the nightly routine, working in the barn until 8 or 9 most evenings, and Cal joined her most nights without being asked, his skills improving faster than she'd expected because he had what good craftsmen always have: patience with imperfection in the learning stage, and the willingness to do the same stitch badly 30 times until the hands learned it right. Denny had progressed further than anyone anticipated, including Denny. He had a natural feeling for tension that she hadn't expected from him, the kind of instinct that usually took years to develop. He still had opinions. He still voiced them. But they were increasingly opinions worth having. One evening in early December, he looked up from a piece he was working on, a water bag repair for the Mercer operation, fiddly work requiring small, precise stitching, and said without preamble, "Crow's been telling people you sewed up old Fletcher's tent with bad thread." Eliza kept her needle moving. "Where'd you hear that?" "Billings at the grain exchange told Cal. Said Crow mentioned it twice this week." "Fletcher's tent hasn't been used yet this winter," she said. "He's keeping his horses inside and the tent's in storage until spring." "I know. That's what Cal told Billings." Denny paused. Billings said Crow seemed annoyed to hear that. She let that sit for a moment. "Good. Keep talking to Billings." Denny went back to his stitching. After a while he said, "Is this going to get bad?" She considered the honest answer. "It might." "How bad?" "I don't know yet." She finished the seam she was on, knotted it, cut the thread. "That depends on what he decides to risk." She found out what he was willing to risk in February. The railroad advance team arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected, pushed forward by a schedule change at the company level that nobody in the valley had been informed about. They came with 40 men, 6 wagons, and a field camp that had been assembled from company stores. Brand new equipment, purchased through Silas Crow's supply contracts, because Silas had moved quickly when he heard the schedule change and offered the railroad a bulk supply deal that was too fast and too convenient for the advance team supervisor to pass up. Eliza heard about their arrival the same morning they set up camp in the flats north of Mill Haven from a young woman named Agnes Pruitt, who washed laundry for the Mercer household and had a gift for knowing everything that happened within 15 miles before anyone else did. "They've got Crow canvas," Agnes said. with the tone of someone delivering news they know is complicated. All of it? Tents and wagon covers both. Bought it last week when the schedule moved up. Crow had it warehoused. Agnes paused. Superintendent's name is Calder, James Calder. He's the one who'll decide about contracts. Eliza thanked her and went straight to find Gideon. The camp was up for 4 days before anything went wrong, which was 4 more days than Eliza had expected because the weather that February was not patient and the mountains were not gentle, and a new canvas operation set up fast by men who didn't have time to check everything carefully was going to find its weaknesses quickly. What she didn't expect was the specific form of it. She was in the barn on a Thursday afternoon, working with Cal on a batch of saddle repairs for the Holloway place, when she heard horses coming fast from the direction of the North Road. Not one horse, several. The kind of pace that meant something had happened. She was at the barn door when they came into the yard. 3 men from the railroad camp, one of them the advance foreman, a lean, sunburned man she'd seen in town once named Garrett. Behind them, in a wagon, was a collapsed tent, the main field tent, the large one that served as the camp's eating and meeting space, its ridgeline broken and the canvas heaped in on itself. She walked toward them before they'd fully stopped. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" Garrett said. "Yes. I need to know what happened to this tent. Superintendent Calder is on his way. There were 4 men inside when the ridge failed. Nobody was badly hurt, but Calder is—" He stopped, controlled his breathing. "He's heard your name. He's saying you did work on the camp equipment." She felt the shape of it immediately, the cold, precise shape of something that had been designed in advance. "I haven't touched any equipment in that camp," she said. "I've never been to that camp." Garrett looked uncertain. "Crow told Calder." "I know what Crow told Calder." She moved to the wagon and began pulling the collapsed canvas toward her. "Help me lay this out. Mrs. Ashcroft, the superintendent, will be here in 20 minutes if he's riding from the North Flat. Help me lay this out." Something in her voice, not volume, not anger, but a particular quality of absolute certainty, moved Garrett off his hesitation. He and the 2 men with him helped her drag the canvas off the wagon and spread it on the frozen ground. She started at the ridgeline. Her hands moved quickly, reading the fabric the way she'd been reading fabric for 14 years, tracing the failure point the way you trace a crack back to its source. She could hear Garrett and the other 2 standing back, watching her work. She didn't look up. She found the primary failure point in 4 minutes. Then she found the secondary. Then the third. She sat back on her heels in the cold mud and looked at what she was looking at, and she felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. The particular feeling of being handed, by your enemy, exactly what you needed. She heard the sound of additional horses arriving in the yard and stood up. James Calder was a large man, mid-50s, with the kind of authority that comes from running large operations for a long time. He rode into the yard with 2 other men and dismounted with the controlled urgency of someone who is furious but has learned to keep it below the surface. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, and his voice carried everything he wasn't saying out loud. "Mr. Calder." She met him in the middle of the yard. "I want to show you something. Before we talk about anything else, I need you to come look at this canvas." He studied her for a moment. She held his gaze without flinching. He walked with her to the spread canvas. She crouched beside the failure point and pointed. "This is where the ridge gave way. This stitch here, see how it's pulled clean out of the weave? That's a single running stitch. 1 pass, no back stitching, no reinforcement at the attachment points." She moved along the canvas. "This entire ridgeline was sewn with a single running stitch throughout. That is not a repair. That is original construction." Calder crouched beside her. He looked at the seam. "I've never been to your camp," she said. "I've never touched this canvas. I can show you my ledger. Every piece of work I've done for 7 months, every customer, every technique used. A flat-felled double stitch with backstitch reinforcement at load points is my signature method. You will not find a single running stitch in anything I've ever repaired." She paused. "This tent was never repaired by me. This tent was built this way. Whoever made it used the cheapest, fastest stitch available and shipped it to you as quality merchandise." Calder didn't say anything. He was looking at the seam, and she could see him doing the calculation. The same calculation any experienced man does when presented with evidence that contradicts what he's been told. "Who supplied this equipment?" she said quietly. He looked up at her. She already knew, but she needed him to say it. He said it. The name hung in the cold February air between them, and Garrett, standing 6 feet away, made a sound like a man who has just understood something he should have seen coming. Calder stood up slowly. He was the kind of man who, once he understood a situation, moved through the stages of response very quickly, which was why he ran large operations and ran them without catastrophic failures. He looked at the tent. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Garrett. "Get me the invoices for the camp equipment," he said to Garrett. "All of them. Today." Garrett was already moving. Calder looked at Eliza for a long moment. She was standing in the mud with her work coat and her cold, stiffened hands, and the ledger she'd carried out from the barn tucked under her arm. And she looked like exactly what she was. Not a fraud, not a threat, but someone who had been very precisely framed and had responded by demonstrating the thing that no amount of rumor could dismantle: the irreducible fact of the work itself. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, and his voice had changed completely from when he arrived. "I owe you an apology." "You were given bad information by someone who had a reason to give it," she said. "That's not your fault. It is my fault for not verifying it before I rode out here ready to—" He stopped. "Can I see the ledger?" She handed it to him. He stood in Gideon's yard in the February cold and read through 7 months of meticulous records, and she stood beside him and answered his questions. And by the time Gideon came riding in from the east pasture and saw the cluster of railroad men in his yard and his wife standing among them with the particular posture of someone who has just won something important, the conversation had already turned its corner. Calder handed the ledger back to her. He looked at Gideon, then back at her. "I need to make some calls to the company," he said. "There are contracts I need to review and some supply arrangements I need to reconsider." He paused. "I would appreciate it if you were available to meet with me next week. Formally." "I'll be available," she said. He nodded. He looked at the collapsed tent one more time, the visible, undeniable record of cheap construction sold as quality goods. And then he looked toward the road to Millhaven with an expression that Eliza recognized, because she had seen it before on the faces of people who had just learned they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted. It was a very specific kind of cold. He mounted his horse. His men followed. The wagon with the ruined tent stayed in the yard because no one had thought to take it. And after they were gone, Gideon walked over to it and stood looking at the spread canvas with its failed seam and its single running stitches and the clear, readable evidence of exactly what had happened. "He used his own tent to frame you," Gideon said quietly. "He used his own product," she said. "The tent was always going to fail. He just made sure I was standing near it when it did." Gideon turned to look at her. "But it didn't work." "No." He looked at the tent again. "Because you knew what to look for." "Because I've been reading failed seams for 14 years. She picked up the ledger from where she'd set it on the wagon seat. "He thought I'd be defending myself. He didn't account for the possibility that the evidence would defend me instead." They stood there for a moment in the cold, the tent spread out between them like a map of someone else's plan. "He's not done," Gideon said. "No." She looked toward town. "But he's out of easy moves. What comes next will be harder for him, and he knows it." She was right that he wasn't done. What she didn't know yet was the particular shape of the weapon he had left, the one he'd been holding in reserve since the beginning, the one that had nothing to do with canvas or rumors or railroad inspectors. It had to do with a document that predated Eliza's arrival by 3 years, sitting in a drawer in Silas Crow's back room, waiting for the moment when he decided the time had come to use it. The meeting with James Calder happened on a Wednesday, in the back room of the land office in Millhaven, which was the only space in town with a table large enough and walls private enough for the kind of conversation Calder needed to have. He brought 2 men from the railroad company with him, a contracts administrator named Howell and a quiet woman named Mrs. Fenn, who turned out to be the company's regional accountant, and who said almost nothing during the first hour, but whose eyes moved over every page of Eliza's ledger with the particular attention of someone who understands numbers the way Eliza understood canvas, Eliza brought the ledger, a sample kit of her materials, and Gideon, who sat beside her and said almost nothing and whose presence she found, to her mild surprise, genuinely steadying. Calder opened the meeting by placing the invoices for the camp equipment on the table. He didn't editorialize. He just put them there face up and let everyone in the room see what they showed. Silas Crow's company name at the top, the equipment specifications in the middle, and at the bottom, in the standard contract language, a quality guarantee that described stitching standards the failed tent had clearly never met. "We've pulled 3 other tents from the batch," Calder said. "Same construction. Single running stitch throughout, no reinforcement at the load points. Every one of them is a liability in mountain weather." He looked at Eliza. "You were right about what you found." "I know," she said, not unkindly, just factually. Mrs. Fenn looked up from the ledger. "You've been operating for just under 8 months. 7.5. And in that time you've completed—" She ran her finger down a column. 63 separate jobs. 64. "I finished a set of freight packs for Donegan the day before yesterday. I haven't entered it yet." Mrs. Fenn made a note. 0 returns, 0 complaints on record. "None." Howell leaned forward. He was a thin man who wore his skepticism openly, which Eliza actually preferred to the kind that hid itself. "Mrs. Ashcroft, what you're running out of a barn on a cattle ranch is not exactly a formal operation. We're talking about contracts that would cover maintenance for the entire northern construction push. Dozens of tents, 100 and some canvas pieces, wagon covers, equipment packs. The volume alone—" "I know the volume," she said. "I've been calculating it since Mr. Donegan mentioned the project in October." She opened the ledger to the back section, the projection pages she'd been building through the winter, the ones she'd started writing the night Donegan's wagon left the yard. "I'd like to show you what I've put together." She walked them through it the same way she'd been walking ranchers through repair logic for 8 months. Not performing, not overselling, just laying out what was true and letting the numbers speak in the plain voice numbers have when they're honest. The materials she'd need and what they'd cost. The workspace expansion required, which meant converting the main barn and building a second work table. The labor. She'd need at minimum 3 more people with basic skills that she could train up, and she already had 2 candidates in mind from the valley who needed the work. The timeline for scaling up before the main construction crew arrived in late spring. She'd priced it all out. She'd priced the railroad's alternative too, continuing with Silas Crow's supply chain or bringing in a formal contractor from Cheyenne, and laid those numbers beside hers in a comparison column that was, charitably, not flattering to either alternative. Mrs. Fenn looked at the comparison column for a long time without speaking. Howell said, "You built all this over the winter?" "I've been thinking about it since October. The writing took 3 evenings. Calder looked at Gideon. "Mr. Ashcroft, your thoughts?" Gideon had been sitting quietly through all of it, and now he straightened slightly in his chair and said, in the direct way he had that she'd come to appreciate more than almost anything about him, "My thoughts are that my wife knows what she's doing and I trust her numbers. The barn conversion she's describing. I can have it ready in 3 weeks if we start immediately. The work tables I can build myself." He paused. "What I can't tell you is whether you should trust her. That's your calculation to make. But I'll tell you I've watched her work for 8 months, and I have not once seen her take on a job she couldn't finish or make a promise she didn't keep." The room was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Fenn said, without looking up from the ledger, "Mr. Calder, the numbers are sound." Calder looked at the projection pages one more time. Then he looked at Eliza with the direct evaluating gaze of a man who has made consequential decisions for a long time and knows the difference between a plan and a credible plan. "We'll need a pilot arrangement," he said, "not the full contract immediately. You take on the repair backlog from the advance camp, the 3 tents we've already pulled and whatever else Garrett's men identify as compromised. You do it on time and on spec, and then we talk about the main contract." "That's fair," she said. "I want weekly reports, materials used, work completed, anything that's showing unexpected wear patterns." "I already keep that. You can have a copy each week." He nodded. Howell was writing. Mrs. Fenn had already moved on to another column in the ledger and was making small, precise notes in the margin of her own notebook. They shook hands at the end. Calder's grip was firm and quick, the handshake of a man with more meetings to get to. Howell's was formal. Mrs. Fenn, on her way out the door, paused and looked back at Eliza and said, "The comparison column was well done. Most people only show their own numbers." "Showing only your own numbers is just telling someone what you want them to believe," Eliza said. "Showing all of them is telling them what's true." Mrs. Fenn looked at her for one more second, something moving behind her eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile, and then she was gone. Gideon and Eliza walked out of the land office into the cold February afternoon and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment without saying anything. Around them, Millhaven moved at its usual pace. The grain exchange, the post, the hardware store, and at the far end of the main street, Silas Crow's general store with its new painted sign and its broad windows and the particular air of permanence that belonged to things that had never been challenged before. "Pilot contract," Gideon said. "It's a start. 3 weeks to convert the barn." "I know. Are you actually sure you can do it in 3 weeks?" He looked at her sideways. "I said I could." "You said it to be supportive. That's different from being sure." A pause. "Cal and I can do it in 3 weeks if the weather holds." "And if it doesn't?" "4, he admitted. "Then I'll tell Garrett 4, she said. "I'd rather give a real number than a hopeful one." He almost said something and then didn't, and she knew him well enough by now to read the expression. It was the one he got when she said something that aligned exactly with how he already thought, and he wasn't sure whether to be pleased or slightly unsettled by that. They walked to where the horse was tied. He helped her up, which she didn't strictly need but had stopped objecting to because she'd realized it wasn't about whether she needed it. It was just a thing he did, the way she made sure his coat collar was turned down properly before he went out in the morning. Small things that didn't mean anything on their own and meant everything collectively. They were halfway home when Gideon said, without any particular build-up, "Crow was watching from his store window when we came out." She had noticed. She hadn't said anything. "He knows what the meeting was," Gideon said. "Yes?" "He's going to move soon, whatever he's been holding back." She had been thinking about this since the tent collapse, about what a man like Silas Crow kept in reserve. The rumors had failed. The inspector had been unconvinced. The manufactured incident had collapsed under the weight of its own evidence. He had tried every tool available to a man who operated through reputation and supply chains and the slow pressure of social influence. What he had left was harder, more direct, the kind of weapon that didn't need her to make a mistake. She found out what it was 4 days later, and it arrived not from Silas himself, but from a lawyer. The man's name was Prescott, and he came from a firm in Cheyenne, and he arrived at the ranch on a gray Saturday morning with a document in a brown envelope and the practiced neutrality of a man who delivers bad news for a living and has learned not to get personally invested in any of it. He asked for Gideon by name, which was the first thing she noticed. Gideon read the document at the kitchen table while Prescott stood by the door. She sat across from him and watched his face, which was the surest way she'd found to understand what something said before she read it herself. She watched the color change in his jaw, watched his eyes move back to the top of the first page and start again, watched his hands go very still on the table. "What is it?" she said. He looked up. His face had the particular stillness of a man who is absorbing something much larger than he expected, and is using everything he has to keep from showing how large it is. He put the document down and slid it across to her. She read it. It took her 3 minutes to read the full document, which was 2 pages in legal language that translated, in plain terms, to this. 4 years ago, before Eliza arrived, before the repair business, before any of it, Gideon had borrowed $240 from a private creditor to cover a catastrophic equipment loss, a collapsed barn roof that had destroyed most of his stored grain and 2 pieces of machinery in the same winter storm. The loan had been arranged through Silas Crow's store, which sometimes served as an informal lending intermediary for ranchers who couldn't access the bank in Cheyenne. The debt had been assigned, but transferred, in the language of the document, from the original creditor to a holding company. The holding company, 3 layers of paperwork deep, was controlled by Silas Crow. The debt was due in 30 days. $240, plus accumulated interest at the original rate, compounded over 4 years. $312 total. She set the document down. Prescott was still standing by the door with his practiced neutral expression. Outside, Cal and Denny were working in the yard, their voices carrying faintly through the wall. The barn that she'd been planning to convert sat 50 yards away, not yet transformed, still holding the work tables and the canvas stock and the equipment of the operation she'd been building for 8 months. "Is there a dispute as to the original debt?" Prescott said. "No," Gideon said. His voice was very even. "The debt was real. I borrowed the money. And the assignment of the debt to the current creditor, was that legal?" Eliza said. Prescott looked at her. "The assignment was executed according to the terms of the original loan agreement, which included a clause permitting transfer. The document was properly filed." "When was it filed?" "The transfer was recorded 7 weeks ago." 7 weeks ago. She ran the timeline in her head. 7 weeks ago was right after Calder's first visit to the ranch, right after the preliminary approval letter, right after Silas had made his purchase offer and been refused. He hadn't bought the debt 7 weeks ago. He'd been holding it for who knew how long, waiting for the moment when he needed it most. 7 weeks ago had been the moment he decided to have it formally recorded, turning a hidden card face up on the table. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the document. "What happens if the debt isn't paid in 30 days?" she asked Prescott. "The creditor has the right to pursue legal remedies, including claim against property used as collateral for the original loan." "The ranch," Gideon said. "The land and primary structures, yes." The room was very quiet. Prescott shifted his weight slightly. She understood that he was not a villain in this, just a delivery mechanism, and she didn't make him feel otherwise. "Thank you," she said. "We'll be in touch." He left. His horse moved away down the road and the yard went back to its normal sounds. Gideon sat at the table looking at the document. He had the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he has always feared and has now actually arrived at. Not panic, he wasn't a man who panicked, but the specific heavy look of someone for whom a long-running fear has finally become concrete. $312, he said, "in 30 days. Eliza." He looked at her. "We don't have it." "I know. The operation, even if Calder gives us the full contract today, we can't generate $300 in 30 days from repairs alone. Not yet." He pushed the document away from him slightly, not throwing it, just moving it out of the center of his vision. He knew that. He timed it exactly right. She had been calculating since Prescott said the number, running figures the way she ran seam measurements, fast from memory, with the adjustments for variables built in. The repair income from the last month, the pilot contract fee, the materials cost for the barn conversion, the wage she'd been planning to pay the additional workers, what was available versus what was owed and what the gap was, and whether the gap was closable. She stood up and went to the shelf where she kept the ledger. "Don't," Gideon said quietly. She stopped, looked at him. "I can see you calculating," he said. "I know what you're doing, and I need you to hear me say something before you get too far into it." He paused. "This is not your debt. This is mine. 4 years old from before you ever got on that train. You built something here. You built something real, and it is not your responsibility to fix what I signed my name to before you arrived." She looked at him for a long moment. "Gideon," she said, "we're married. I know your debt is my debt. Your ranch is my ranch." She said it quietly, not as a declaration, just as a correction of a misunderstanding. "We can have a conversation about whose name is on what piece of paper, or we can have a conversation about how to solve this. I'd rather have the second one." He was quiet. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to manage or conceal, and it was the kind of thing that in a different kind of story might have led to a different kind of moment, but this was not that kind of story, and they were not that kind of people, and after a moment he simply nodded. "All right," he said. "How do we solve it?" She sat back down with the ledger. She was awake until after midnight that night, writing. Not in the ledger, in a separate document, long sheets of paper that she'd gotten from the land office supply months ago and had been using for calculations. She worked through every number she had. The pilot contract fee was real but small, enough to cover materials and wages, not much beyond. The rancher repair income was steady but modest. The barn conversion would cost money before it made money. $312 in 30 days was not possible through normal operations. She knew that within the first 20 minutes of calculating. She stopped trying to make the ordinary numbers add up and started thinking about what was outside the ordinary. She thought about James Calder and the full contract he'd described, the one that covered the entire northern construction push. She thought about Mrs. Fenn and the way she had looked at the comparison column. She thought about what Calder had said about the camp equipment. 3 compromised tents, but she knew from what Garrett had told her that the compromised equipment wasn't 3 pieces. It was likely much more. Silas's entire supply batch was built to the same standard as the collapsed tent. If the railroad was going to be running a construction operation through mountain weather for a full season, they were going to need every piece of that equipment evaluated and either certified or repaired, and they needed it done before the main crew arrived. That was not a pilot contract. That was the full contract. Now, compressed into a timeline that no one had planned for. She wrote for another hour. Then she set down the pen and looked at what she'd written. It was a proposal. More aggressive than anything she'd put in front of Calder at the land office. It asked for an advance against the full seasonal contract, not a large advance, a specific number, large enough to cover the debt, and the materials for the barn conversion, and the first month's wages for additional workers, against the guaranteed work of evaluating and repairing the entire advanced camp equipment inventory and maintaining it through the construction season. She was asking the railroad to front her money against work she hadn't done yet. She knew what that meant. She knew the risk. If she asked and Calder said no, she'd have shown her desperation and potentially damaged the relationship she'd been carefully building. If she asked and the numbers weren't persuasive enough, she'd lose the pilot arrangement too. But if she didn't ask, if she tried to manage the debt another way, sell something, borrow from someone, delay, she was playing Silas's game on his timeline with his rules. She wasn't going to do that. She woke Gideon at 5 in the morning, which was earlier than he normally rose, but not dramatically so because the ranch ran on early hours. She put the proposal in front of him and a cup of coffee beside it. He read it. He read it carefully, which she'd expected. He asked 2 questions, which she answered. Then he put it down and drank his coffee. "You're asking them to advance against unfinished work," he said, "against guaranteed work. There's a difference. To a banker, there isn't. Calder's not a banker. He's a builder. He thinks about whether a thing will get done, not about financial categories." She looked at him across the table. "He's seen my ledger. He's seen the pilot work. He knows that when I say I'll do something, I do it. And if he says no?" She had been sitting with that question since 2 in the morning. "Then we find another way. But I think he'll say yes, Gideon, because the alternative, shotgun, for him, is going into the main construction season with compromised equipment and a supply chain he can no longer trust. He needs this solved as much as we need the money." Gideon held the coffee cup with both hands and looked at the proposal for a long moment. "When are you going to present it?" he said. "Today. This morning, if he's in camp. He might not be ready for—" "Silas gave us 30 days. I'm not spending 3 of them waiting for the right moment." She stood up. "The right moment is the one I make." Garrett met her at the camp perimeter and sent word to Calder, who came out of the main operations tent looking like a man who had already had a complicated morning and was expecting the afternoon to match it. He looked at Eliza standing in the camp with her proposal in her hand, and he said, "Mrs. Ashcroft, I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said. "I need 30 minutes of your time." He looked at her for a moment, then at the proposal she was holding, then back at her. "Come inside," he said. She laid it out in the same way she'd laid everything out. Without performance, without pressure, just the plain logic of it and the numbers behind it. She told him about the debt. She didn't dress it up or frame it as a story she wanted him to feel sympathetic about. She told him the facts, the amount, the timeline, and why it existed, and she let him be an adult who could evaluate what she was telling him on its merits. She told him what she needed from the railroad and what she was prepared to deliver in exchange. She gave him the timeline for the barn conversion and the expanded operation. She told him what she believed the true extent of the compromised camp equipment was, based on what she'd seen from the collapsed tent and the manufacturing pattern it showed. And she told him what it would cost to evaluate and repair it all, versus what it would cost him if a second tent failed during the construction season. Calder listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You're telling me your personal debt is affecting your ability to fulfill a railroad contract. I'm telling you that a man who couldn't stop me through quality challenges or reputation damage has found a financial lever, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She met his eyes. "I'm also telling you that the work I'm offering to do is real. The numbers are honest. And if you look at this from a purely operational standpoint, the question isn't whether I need the advance. The question is whether the advance makes sense for the railroad." Calder looked at the proposal. He looked at the numbers. He picked up the page with the comparison column. She'd included one again, this time comparing the cost of the advance plus her full contract against the cost of sourcing a replacement contractor from Cheyenne on the compressed timeline. He set it down. "I need to make 2 calls," he said. "One to Howell, one to Mrs. Fenn." "Of course." "Come back at 4 o'clock." She came back at 4 o'clock. Mrs. Fenn was there this time, with her notebook and her precise handwriting and her way of sitting that somehow communicated complete attention without any visible effort. The conversation at 4 o'clock was shorter than the one in the morning. Calder had clearly done his own calculating in the interim, and Mrs. Fenn had apparently done calculations of her own that she summarized in 6 sentences, none of which were wasted. The answer was yes, with conditions. The conditions were reasonable. Milestones tied to the advance, a weekly report as already discussed, a formal written agreement that Howell would draft. The advance was not exactly what she'd asked for. It was 80% of what she'd asked for, which was the number Mrs. Fenn had apparently decided was appropriate, and which Eliza accepted without argument because 80% was enough. She rode home in the last light of the February afternoon with the signed letter of intent in her coat pocket and the specific feeling in her chest of someone who has run a very long way and has not fallen and is still not entirely sure it's safe to stop moving. Gideon was waiting on the porch. He saw her face before she said anything. "Yes," he said. 80% of what I asked, enough to cover the debt and start the conversion." He let out a breath. He sat down on the porch step, which was unusual for him. He didn't usually sit down like that, just dropped onto the nearest surface, as if his legs had made a decision before he did. She sat beside him. The cold was settling in as the light went, the particular February cold that arrived quickly after sunset. 30 days, he said. 28 now. Is it enough time? To pay the debt? Yes. The advance covers it. She looked at the barn. The conversion is going to be tight. I need the additional workers before I need the new tables, so I'll start there. He nodded. He was looking at the barn too, at the structure he'd built partly himself and which had housed his livestock and his stored grain and his equipment through years of seasons, and which was about to become something different, something larger. "I'm going to need your help," she said. "Not just building tables. I'm going to need you to believe this is going to work and not show anyone when you're not sure about it." He looked at her. "I always believe you." "No, you don't. Sometimes you're scared." A pause. "Yes. Sometimes I'm scared." "That's fine. That's honest." She looked at the letter of intent in her hand. "Just don't let Crow see it. When he comes to collect the debt, and he will come himself, he'll want to see our faces when he does. I need him to see that we're not afraid of him." Gideon looked out at the dark road that led to Millhaven and was quiet for a moment. "What if he finds another angle," he said, "between now and the 30 days? He might. He's resourceful and he's angry, and angry, resourceful people are dangerous." She folded the letter carefully and put it back in her coat. "But he's used his best weapons. The rumor didn't hold. The inspector didn't stay bought. The incident blew up in his face, and now the debt—" She paused. "He's counting on us not being able to move fast enough, and we move faster than he expected." "We," Gideon said. Not a question. Just the word placed carefully. She looked at him. "I keep saying I," she said. "Old habit." "I noticed," he said. I didn't want to say anything. The cold settled around them. In the barn, one of the horses moved and the sound of it carried clearly in the still air. Down the road somewhere, Silas Crow was in his store, or his back room, or wherever he spent his evenings, and he was either calculating his next move or waiting for the 30 days to run out with the confidence of a man who believed he had played his final card correctly. He had played it correctly. He just hadn't accounted for who he was playing against. The 28 days that followed were the hardest Eliza had worked in her life, and she had not lived an easy life. The barn conversion started the morning after she came home with the letter of intent, before the sun was fully up, before breakfast, before anything. Gideon and Cal began pulling the old stall partitions while Denny and Eliza moved the canvas stock and tool inventory to the far end of the structure so the work could happen around it without stopping. The horse that had been stabled there moved to a temporary pen Gideon built in an afternoon using materials he'd been meaning to use for something else for 2 years. It was not graceful, it was cold and loud, and there were arguments. Not angry ones, but the practical friction of 4 people trying to do 3 different things in the same space simultaneously. Cal hit his thumb with a hammer on the second morning and swore in a sustained, creative way that made even Denny look impressed. One of the new work tables Gideon built was 3 inches lower on one side than the other, which Eliza discovered when she tried to lay canvas flat on it and it slid. She didn't say anything about it that morning. She found a wedge and shimmed the short leg and kept moving. The first new worker arrived on day 3. Her name was Ruth Calvert, and she was the wife of a grain farmer whose operation had failed the previous season. Not from weather or bad luck, but from a combination of debt and a market price collapse that had left them with land they couldn't sell and bills they couldn't pay. She was 44, with broad, capable hands and the slightly guarded expression of a woman who has been humbled by circumstances and is trying not to show how much it cost her. She'd heard about the work through Agnes Pruitt, who seemed to operate as an informal employment notice board for the Valley's women, and she showed up at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning with her coat buttoned to the top and her chin level. "I don't know how to sew canvas," she said to Eliza, before Eliza had said anything past hello. "I can sew regular cloth, I can follow instructions, and I work hard and I don't quit in the middle of something." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "Can you start today?" Ruth looked slightly surprised. "Yes." "Good. Come inside." She put Ruth on basic stitching practice that first morning. The same progression she'd used with Cal and Denny, scrap canvas and a heavy needle, and the same fundamental movements repeated until the hands started to learn them. Ruth's regular sewing background actually helped. She had the grip and the rhythm already. She just needed to learn the scale and the technique. By afternoon, she was doing a passable flat-felled stitch. By the end of the week, she was doing it well enough for actual work. The second new worker was unexpected. Eliza came out of the barn on the 5th day to find a girl of about 16 sitting on the porch step, and the girl stood up quickly when she saw Eliza and said, "I heard you're teaching people canvas work." "Who are you?" "Nora Gage. My father has the horse operation out on the East Road." Fletcher's neighbor. "Does your father know you're here?" A pause. "He knows I left the house this morning." Eliza looked at her. The girl was trying very hard to look calm and not quite managing it. She had the particular tension of someone who has made a decision they're not sure was the right one and is committed to it anyway. "How old are you?" 17. She was probably 16. Eliza let it go. "Can you hold tension in your hands for 4 or 5 hours at a stretch?" "Yes." "The work is not glamorous, it's repetitive, and the barn is cold, and some of the material smells bad." I don't care about glamorous," Nora said. Eliza looked at her for another moment. "Go tell your father where you are. Come back when you've told him." Nora went and came back in under an hour, which meant Fletcher's neighbor lived close and had either spoken very quickly or hadn't spoken much at all. Eliza didn't ask which. She put Nora on the same practice progression as Ruth. By the end of the first week, the barn was converted, imperfectly but functionally. The work tables were in place. The lighting, additional lamps hung from the rafters at Eliza's direction, was better than it had been. The material storage was organized in a way that made sense for the workflow, with the most commonly used weights of canvas closest to the primary work area and the specialty materials on the shelves Gideon had built along the east wall. It didn't look like a professional shop. It looked like a barn that had been organized by practical people under time pressure, which was exactly what it was. But it worked. The pilot contract work from the railroad camp arrived in 2 loads. Garrett supervising the delivery himself, 12 pieces of compromised canvas equipment pulled from the advance camp inventory. Eliza went through all 12 on the first day, the same reading process she applied to everything. Hands first, then eyes, then a detailed note in the ledger about each piece, what had failed, why, what the repair required, and her estimate of time. She gave Calder the assessment report the following morning. Of the 12 pieces, 9 were repairable. 2 were beyond saving, and she said so directly, with an explanation of why, and recommended specific replacement specs that would perform properly under mountain conditions. 1 piece was borderline, and she described exactly what a repair would and wouldn't do, and let Calder decide. He read the report, asked 2 questions, and approved the repair work. The work went quickly, not because it was easy, but because everyone in the barn had been trained to a consistent standard, and the standard held. Ruth turned out to have the best eye for the subtle stress patterns in aged canvas, an instinct that surprised Eliza and shouldn't have, given that Ruth had spent 20 years mending things under her own kind of pressure. Nora was fast, faster than anyone expected, with the accuracy rate of someone much more experienced, and Denny had developed into a genuinely skilled hand who could take a piece from inspection to finished repair with minimal supervision. Cal oversaw the workflow with the quiet competence of someone who has found the thing he's unexpectedly good at and is trying not to make a fuss about it. On day 14, Eliza sent Calder the first weekly report. It covered the 9 completed repairs, the materials used, the time breakdown. At the end of the report, she added an inventory note. Based on her assessment of the compromised batch and the construction pattern it showed, she estimated between 30 and 40 additional pieces of advanced camp equipment were likely compromised to varying degrees and recommended a full inventory review before the main construction crew arrived. Calder called for the full inventory review the following day. She spent 2 days in the camp with Garrett, going through every canvas piece systematically, and the number she'd estimated turned out to be conservative. There were 47 pieces that needed attention, ranging from minor preventive reinforcement to significant repair. She wrote the full assessment in the ledger and made a copy for Calder and didn't say anything about what it implied for Silas Crow's supply contract because she didn't need to. The document said everything that needed saying. Calder read the full assessment and went very quiet in the particular way of a man who is calculating the cost of a mistake that someone else made and that he is going to have to answer for to people above him. "Can you do all of it?" he said, "before the main crew arrives?" "Yes, if I start immediately and the materials I've ordered arrive on time." "When did you order them?" 10 days ago. She'd ordered them the day after the pilot contract was confirmed, before the full assessment was done, because she'd known what the assessment was likely to show, and she wasn't willing to lose 2 weeks to waiting. He looked at her. He looked at her in the way she'd noticed a few people had started to look at her over the past several months. Not with surprise exactly, but with the expression of someone updating an internal picture that keeps turning out to have been too small. "Full contract," he said. "I'll have Howell draft it." The full contract came through on day 17. Gideon read it at the kitchen table that evening and didn't say anything for a long time. He turned the pages slowly, reading each clause with the attention of a man who has learned to read things carefully because he once didn't and it cost him. When he finished, he set it down and picked up his coffee and looked at the far wall. "The payment terms," he said. "First installment on signing, enough to cover the debt with $30 left over." He nodded slowly. "We need to pay Prescott," she said. "Send the bank draft to him directly. I don't want the money anywhere near Silas." "Agreed." He set down the coffee. He had the look she'd come to know. The one that lived somewhere between relief and a kind of sadness that didn't have a clean name. The look of a man who has been afraid for a very long time and is still not entirely sure it's over. 28 days left on the debt notice. This pays it with 11 days to spare. Yes. He's going to be furious. Probably, she said. Or he'll be something colder than furious. He's not a man who loses his head. He'll understand what it means and he'll decide what's next. "Is there a next?" Gideon said. "After this? After the contract? After the debt's paid? What lever does he have left?" She had been thinking about this. Not obsessively, not fearfully, but with the same practical attention she gave to every problem that was still moving. Silas Crow had operated in this valley for a long time through a specific kind of power, the power of being necessary. You needed his goods, so you needed him. When you needed him, he could set the terms. It was simple, and it had worked for years. What she'd built in the barn had not directly attacked that power. She hadn't tried to undersell his store or take over his supply lines. She'd just given people an alternative for the specific, constant, expensive problem of broken things. And in doing so, without meaning to, or maybe partly meaning to, she'd shown the valley that necessary wasn't the same as irreplaceable. That was what he couldn't recover from. Not the railroad contract, not the debt payment, not any single thing she'd done. It was the shift in how people thought about him. Once you show someone that there's another option, they don't entirely forget that the option exists. Even if they go back to the original supplier, something has changed. The power isn't as absolute. The terms aren't as fixed. I don't think there's a lever, she said finally. Not one that works on us the way he needs it to. He could try to hurt the railroad relationship, but Calder's moved past him now. The supply contracts are under review at the company level. He could try new rumors, but there's too much recorded work for rumors to take hold anymore. She paused. The best thing he can do for himself is leave us alone and focus on rebuilding what he's lost somewhere else. Will he? I don't know him. Men like him sometimes do and sometimes don't. She looked at the contract on the table. But it's not our problem to solve. Our problem is to do the work. They signed the contract the next morning and sent the bank draft to Prescott the same afternoon. Eliza went back to the barn. The following 11 days were the strangest she'd experienced since arriving in Wyoming, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing dramatic happened, and she wasn't used to that. She worked. The barn worked. The team that had assembled around her without any formal plan, Cal, Denny, Ruth, Nora, and occasionally Gideon himself on the heavy lifting work, functioned with the imperfect but real cohesion of people who have learned each other's rhythms under pressure. She caught mistakes. She made some of her own. A misread grain direction on a piece of aged canvas that she caught before it mattered. A materials order that came in one weight too light and had to be supplemented from her existing stock, burning through more lamp oil than she'd budgeted in the first week and having to adjust. Small things. The kind of small things that real operations run on. The constant low-level friction of trying to do something real in the actual world. She didn't find them discouraging. She found them informative. Every mistake was data. Every correction made the operation better. On the morning of the 29th day, one day past Prescott's original deadline, Silas Crow came to the ranch. Eliza had wondered how he would come, whether he'd send someone, whether he'd make a show of it, whether he'd arrive early in the morning or at midday when the yard was at its most visible. She'd imagined various versions of his arrival and prepared herself for several of them. He came alone, mid-morning, on a horse she didn't recognize. A dark gray, well-kept, not a working animal. He came at a walk. He looked like a man who has decided exactly what kind of face he's going to wear for this conversation and put it on in the mirror before he left. Gideon came out of the barn when he heard the horse, and he stood in the yard with his arms at his sides. Eliza was at the barn door. Behind her, she was aware of the sounds of the operation, the particular rhythm of work that had become the ambient music of the ranch over the past month. Ruth's steady stitch, Denny's low voice explaining something to Nora, the faint creak of the new work table. Silas dismounted. He looked at the yard, at the 2 wagons from the railroad camp that were there for the week's work, at the organized tool rack by the barn door, at the simple visible evidence of the operation that had been built in the time he'd been counting on being enough to destroy it. His face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did, briefly, before he controlled it. Ashcroft, he said. Crow, Gideon said. Silas looked at Eliza. I received a bank draft from your attorney. The debt in full. That's right, she said. A pause. He looked at the railroad wagons again, at the barn. He was calculating something, she could tell, adding up what he was seeing and comparing it against what he'd expected to find when he arrived today. He'd expected to find a struggling operation, maybe. A yard that looked like pressure. People who had the look of people who'd barely made it. What he found was a Wednesday morning in a working repair shop. "You moved fast," he said. It was almost a compliment, in the way that certain acknowledgments from certain people contain within them everything they're not willing to say directly. "I had good reasons to," she said. He nodded once. He looked at Gideon. "The debt is settled. We have no further financial arrangement." "Correct," Gideon said. Silas looked at Eliza one more time, and she held his gaze, and what passed between them in that moment was not victory and defeat in the dramatic sense, not triumph and humiliation. It was something more honest than that. It was two people who had been in a real conflict, not a clean one, not a fair one, but a real one, recognizing each other clearly for possibly the first time, without the pretense of community friendliness or the theater of offers and refusals. He had underestimated her. She could see that he knew it, not because she was cleverer than him, she wasn't sure that was even true, but because he had looked at what she was doing and seen a small annoyance when he should have seen a serious operation. By the time he adjusted his assessment, she'd already built something he couldn't dismantle from the outside. "I'll say this," he said, and his voice had shed some of its practiced quality, going down a layer to something that was at least closer to his actual register. "You work harder than I expected." "Most people do," she said, "when the situation requires it." He got back on his horse. He rode away, and he did not look back. And Eliza watched him go until he reached the road and turned toward Millhaven, and then she went back into the barn. Ruth looked up from her work. "Was that him?" "Yes." "What did he want?" "To see what we'd built." She picked up her needle. "He's seen it." Ruth looked at her for a moment with the direct look she'd developed over the past weeks. The look of a woman who has been through her own hard passage and recognizes the weight of other people's. "And?" "And he left," Eliza said. "That's enough." The main construction crew arrived in late April, 3 weeks ahead of the schedule that had originally been projected. Calder sent word 2 days before, which was 2 days more notice than she'd expected, but still tight enough that the barn ran at full capacity for both of those days, finishing the last of the advanced camp repairs and staging everything for the increased volume. 61 workers, 11 wagons, a field operation that spread across the North Flat and pushed toward the mountain pass with the particular organized chaos of large-scale construction, loud and fast and constantly generating problems. And among those problems, daily, the specific category of problems that belonged to Eliza. The first week was the hardest, not because the work was beyond her. She'd trained for it, prepared for it, projected the volume accurately enough that they weren't overwhelmed. It was hard because of the human texture of it, the things you couldn't project. A laborer who brought in a tent that had been improperly stored and had mildew through the base, requiring a full replacement of the lower seam that added 4 hours to her day. A wagon cover that had been wrongly identified as a standard size and turned out to be a non-standard cut that required her to adapt her materials on the fly. Nora getting sick for 3 days in the second week, which created a gap in the workflow that everyone else had to absorb. And absorbing it showed them all where the operation was still thinner than it needed to be. She addressed each problem as it arrived. No planning survived first contact with a real operation intact. And she'd learned long ago that the mark of a capable person wasn't that they anticipated everything, but that they responded to what actually happened without falling apart. She added a 5th worker in the 3rd week, a quiet man named Joseph, who had done tent work in a different territory and needed minimal training and slotted into the workflow so smoothly that it almost worried her, because things that went smoothly in the early stages sometimes fell apart later in ways you didn't see coming. She watched him carefully for 2 weeks, and then stopped watching and trusted him, because at some point watching is just anxiety wearing the costume of diligence. Gideon managed the supply side, the material orders, the deliveries, the logistics that didn't require her specific knowledge, but required someone competent and organized who could be trusted not to let something run out at the wrong moment. He wasn't a businessman in any formal sense, and he would have said so if asked, but he was methodical, and he didn't pretend to know things he didn't know. And he asked questions when he wasn't sure, which was better than most. There was a night in the 5th week when she came in from the barn at 9 o'clock, which was later than she'd planned, and found Gideon sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts from the week spread out in front of him and a look on his face that she'd seen a few times and had learned to read accurately. "What is it?" she said. Not a question. She already knew there was something. "The material supplier in Cheyenne is raising prices on the heavy canvas." He showed her the letter. "Effective next month. 12%. She sat down across from him and read the letter. 12% on the heavy canvas meant a meaningful adjustment to the current contract margins. Not catastrophic, but enough to require renegotiation or a shift in material sourcing. "There's a supplier in Denver," she said. "I looked at their rates in January, but they were slightly higher than Cheyenne at the time." At the time. "I'll write to them tomorrow. If their prices are still within range of Cheyenne's new rate, I'll switch." She set down the letter. "And I'll need to flag it in the next weekly report to Calder. It'll affect the Q3 pricing if we absorb it, which we can, but I'd rather tell him now than have him see it in the invoices." Gideon looked at her. "You never stop, do you?" She looked back at him. "What?" Calculating, planning, looking at what's next. She wasn't sure if this was criticism or something else. "Is that a problem?" "No." He shook his head. "No, I'm not. I didn't mean it that way. I meant—" He stopped and tried again, which was a thing she'd noticed he did when the first version of what he wanted to say wasn't quite right. "I've been running this ranch for 8 years. I've worked hard every one of those years. And the whole time I've been reacting. Problem comes up, deal with it. Debt comes in, manage it. Storm happens, absorb it." He looked at the accounts on the table. "You don't react. You see it coming and you're already moving before it arrives." She thought about that for a moment. "I've failed at things," she said. "I've missed things I should have seen. The mildew tent in the first week. I should have built that possibility into the schedule, and I didn't. It cost us 4 hours." "That's not the same. It's exactly the same. I just fix it faster because I've had more practice." She looked at him. "You've been managing a ranch alone for 8 years, Gideon. That's not reacting. That's surviving. And surviving is different from failing." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't think less of the surviving." "I think it's the hardest thing there is," she said. "Anyone can succeed when conditions cooperate. Surviving when they don't, that's what character is." He held her gaze. Outside, the wind had come up, the same north wind that had been running through the valley since April, carrying the sound of the construction camp 3 miles away on the nights it came from the right direction. Sometimes she could hear it when she was in the barn, a distant, low presence that reminded her what all of this was connected to. "Eliza," he said, and the way he said her name had something in it that had been building for a while, she thought. Since the tent collapse, maybe. Or since the meeting with Calder. Or since the morning she'd woken him at 5 to show him a proposal that meant asking a railroad company to trust them with money they hadn't earned yet. "I want to ask you something." She waited. "When you answered my letter," he said, "when you read it and decided to come, what were you expecting?" She considered the honest answer. "I was expecting exactly what you described. A struggling operation. A man who needed help. Work that was real and difficult and wouldn't be finished." She paused. "I was not expecting to like it as much as I do." He looked at her. "The work?" "All of it." She said it quietly, without drama, because she was not a dramatic person, and neither was he. And the most important things between people like them didn't announce themselves with fanfare. They just settled into place the way a good repair settles. Not perfect, not invisible, but solid. Honest. Stronger at the seam than anywhere else. Gideon reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way a man does when he's not sure what to say but wants to say something. She let it stay. Then she picked up the Denver supplier letter and said, "I'll need to look at the current pricing on mid-weight canvas, too, while I'm writing them. We're going through more than I projected." He laughed. It was genuine, the real laugh she'd heard maybe a dozen times. Not polished or performed, but the kind that escapes a person because something caught them unprepared. "Of course you will," he said. She smiled too, which was the closest she came to laughing, generally. Close enough. The summer ran long and hard, and the construction pushed into the mountain pass and generated exactly the problem she'd expected, and a handful she hadn't. The barn operation grew by 2 more workers before July. Ruth turned out to have a teaching instinct that Eliza hadn't expected and started handling the training for new arrivals, which freed Eliza to focus on the assessment and complex repair work that only she could do at the level the railroad required. Denny left in August, not badly. He left to take a paid position with a saddlery in Mill Haven that had opened recently, which was partly a consequence of the valley's general economic expansion, and partly a consequence of the fact that he was now a genuinely skilled craftsman, and skilled craftsmen had options. He shook Eliza's hand on his last day and said, without quite meeting her eyes, "I was wrong about you. In the beginning." "I know," she said. "I should have said it sooner." "It doesn't matter." He looked at her then. "It matters to me," he said. And then he got on his horse and rode toward his new job, and that was the last she saw of him for several months, until he came back in November to ask if she had overflow work she could send to the saddlery, because they had the space and the people, but not yet the railroad connections. She gave him the overflow work. It made sense. Cal stayed. Cal, she'd come to understand, was the kind of person who found a place where good work was valued and didn't see a reason to leave. And she valued him more than she'd probably said directly. She told him so one afternoon in September, and he looked slightly embarrassed and then went back to his work, which was the appropriate response from a man of his particular temperament. The railroad construction season ended in October, which was almost exactly 1 year after Eliza had stepped off the train in Mill Haven with her trunk and her leather tool bag and the long tear in a wagon cover to greet her. The final accounts were settled, the final report went to Calder, and the final payment came through with a note from Mrs. Fenn that said, in her precise economical handwriting, "Your documentation has been exemplary. We anticipate reaching out regarding next season." Eliza read the note and put it in the ledger. She didn't frame it or post it on the wall or show it to anyone as a trophy. It went in the ledger with everything else, the evidence of what had been done, recorded in the same plain hand that had recorded the first repair on a farm wagon in October of the year before. What Silas Crow did in the aftermath was smaller than Eliza had expected and larger than he would have wished. The railroad's supply contracts were formally reviewed and restructured, a process that took several months and concluded with significantly reduced terms for Crow's operation. He remained in business. He was too entrenched in the valley's day-to-day commerce for any single setback to close him entirely. But the particular kind of power he'd operated through, the sense that he was necessary, the way people measured what they needed against what he charged and felt they had no alternative, that had changed and didn't change back. She heard about it secondhand, mostly, through the same informal network that had given her Donegan's name and Calder's schedule. She didn't spend time thinking about it. She had other things to think about. The ranch in its second year looked nothing like the ranch she'd arrived at. Not because it had been transformed into something grand, it hadn't. The cabin still had the same small front room with the floor that Gideon had finally put in properly the previous spring. The chicken coop was no longer listing because Cal had fixed it in an afternoon when it started listing the other direction. The cottonwood by the water pump was the same tree it had always been, but the barn held a working operation that employed 5 people full-time and 2 part-time, and the wagons that came through the yard were not just neighboring ranchers with damaged grain sacks anymore. They were freighters and construction operators, and a mining outfit that had heard about the work through Donegan, and the ledger that had started as a plain cloth-covered book was now the second ledger, the first one having been filled completely and stored on the shelf next to the window where the light came in good in the mornings. She sat with it one evening in late October, the first real quiet evening after the season wound down, the first evening in months that didn't have a deadline pressing on it, and she went through it the way she sometimes did, not looking for anything specific, just reading the record of what had been done. Every job, every repair, every piece of broken thing that had come in and gone out sound. The wagon cover from the first week, Harlan Mercer's storage canvas, Donegan's freight tent, the railroad advance camp, the 47 compromise pieces that had started the full contract, the hundreds of items that had come after. She closed the ledger. Gideon came in from the yard and saw her at the table with the ledger closed in front of her and the particular expression she got when she'd been going through accounts and had arrived somewhere in her own thinking. "All right," he said. Yes. She looked up at him. I was thinking about the wagon cover, the first one. He poured himself coffee and sat down. The one that was torn when you arrived. If it hadn't been there, she said, if the yard had been tidy, if there hadn't been something obviously broken to fix. You'd have found something, he said. Maybe. But that particular tear was what showed me what the ranch actually needed, not what you thought you needed when you wrote the letter. She paused. Sometimes the broken thing is the door. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning properly tonight. She'd trimmed it herself, and the light was steady and warm, and the barn was quiet outside, and the north wind that had run through the valley all summer had finally laid down. I wanted curtains, he said. When I wrote that letter, I don't know what I thought. Someone to make the cabin feel less empty, someone to cook and keep things, and make it feel like a home that a person actually lived in. And instead, she said, I got you. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said most true things. And the cabin feels lived in because it is, and the ranch doesn't just feel like a home, it works like one. He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. You know what I understand now that I didn't understand before? She waited. A home isn't a place that looks right, he said. It's a place where the work is real and the people doing it know what they're doing, and there's enough trust between them to keep going when things go wrong. He looked at her. You built that here, not me. You. She shook her head. We, she said. Remember? He remembered. She could see it in his face, the acknowledgement of all the times she'd corrected that particular habit in herself, the slow shared grammar of two people learning each other's language. We, he said. Outside the valley was dark and cold and getting ready for its winter, the way it always did, without ceremony, without asking permission, just arriving the way seasons arrive. In the barn, the tools were put away properly, the materials were stocked and covered, the work tables sat empty and ready for whatever came next. The ledger on the shelf held everything that had been done. The blank pages at the back held everything that hadn't happened yet. Eliza Rowan Ashcroft looked at her husband across the table in the lamplight and thought about the letters she'd answered, and the train she'd taken, and the toolkit she'd packed instead of dresses, and the torn wagon cover she'd seen from 30 yards away before she'd even looked at the cabin. She didn't believe that things happened for reasons in any cosmic sense. She believed that people made choices, and choices had consequences. And the consequences of good choices made with clear eyes and capable hands tended, over time, to accumulate into something that looked, from a certain angle, in the right light, a little like a life worth living. This was that. It wasn't perfect. It was real, which was better. And the smallest stitch she'd ever put into a piece of torn canvas had been the first one, and even that one had held.